masculinity will be understood in very primitive terms of how it would display itself, let's say, in that a primal man, this primal man, right? Wild primal man. Whether this is like a Tarzan or Terminator, right? In a sense of the actor that played that, the bodybuilding, all this, the masculinity would be seen through only the form. And of course, it's all within the cultural context. What was in fact happening is complete and utter departure from a much more harmonious understanding of what each gender plays in the cosmic drama of creation, how each one of us here are the embodiment of the eternal cosmic principles.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Going Out Looking In, the podcast where we're exploring the human experience through conscious conversations. My name is Maxi, I'm your host, and today we are exploring the world of surrender and sovereignty, of masculinity and fatherhood, of intimacy, self-realization, and self-illumination, and that is with my guest, Igor Kufayev. Igor is an artist, a Advaita Tantra teacher, and founder for the not-for-profit organization Flowing Wakefulness. Igor has been serving as a teacher for awakening towards the new era of heart-centered consciousness for now over 2 decades. He's born in Uzbekistan, classically trained in art from a young age, and a one-time student of the St. Petersburg Academy of Fine Arts. He enjoyed an international art career by his mid-30s after then pursuing a career in spirituality and becoming a teacher. Igor and myself crossed paths on social media after I saw a reel of his on my Explore page, and I was struck by this man's presence. Go to your Instagram right now, Igor Kufayev, and look him up. You'll know what I mean. The way that he carries himself, the way he speaks is so pure, so present, so calm, so collected, so precise and potent that I immediately, after 20 seconds, reached out to him and asked him to be part of the podcast. Gladly, he said yes. This conversation is a mouthful. This conversation is a deep dive. So I was present. I was present to match the presence of Igor for this conversation. And it was such an eloquent one. It was such a fine one, a subtle one, a nuanced one, where the way that words were used were very poetic and very deep. I mean, like I said in the very beginning of this, we were talking, so many different topics, but the way that Igor delivers what he is speaking about, and also the kind of perspective that he applies to topics such as, for example, surrender, which we talk about here on the podcast so many times, so often, he connected it to a completely different thing, to sovereignty. It's like, I've never thought about it this way. And that is for the rest of the conversation. It is a deep dive. You definitely, want to be sort of centered for this one. You want to maybe, really Take your time with this. It's quite a long one and a deep one. And going into the subtle realms of what has been said here and feel into the different topics and how they resonate with you. This is really an invitation from me to you. With all that being said, and before hitting the stage for this conversation, just another reminder. September 16th to 21st, we are summiting. We are coming together for going out looking in the experience. At the time of the publication of this podcast, we are in the final days of the early bird special for this experience. If you have been listening to this podcast previously and sort of felt a resonance to the deeper topics of life, to exploring yourself deeper, which is also part of this conversation. It's all about this, exploring the human experience through your lens, through your body, through your soul, through your heart. If you're looking for like-minded individuals, come to Germany, join us. This is gonna be deep. 6 days. We have 6 days together in a beautiful location. It's a beautiful 8,000 square meter ground with tiny houses spread all over, even a tree house, a big main villa where we're going to be doing the sacred work. With me, 2 of my favorite teachers, more than 40 years combined experience in facilitating. Shems Hartwell from Hawaii, Chrissy Fire-Main from Australia. This is powerful stuff, people. We're gonna be diving into breath work, somatic exercises, group work, individual processes, relational work, emotional work, all based on the 3 pillars of this event: the physical pillar, the emotional pillar, and the ceremonial/spiritual pillar. Everything is gonna be addressed. 6 days. A small group is forming, 18 people, 9 men and 9 women. Be fast. Go to goingoutlookingin.com now and save your spot today. With all that being said, I wish you the most beautiful insights of this conversation with myself and Igor Kufayev. So also for the listeners, just inviting us all to arrive in the space where we are right now, if that is sitting, if that is walking, if that is driving, and if it's safe to go a little bit more inward by slowing down the breath and closing your eyes, then that's what I would invite us to do. I always like to have my feet on the ground and to feel my body really firmly pressing against the chair that I'm sitting in. I have a good support, upright spine, open chest. And just invite us to feel into the physical form for a moment. How does that feel today for you? How is it to be alive in this vessel of the body, the house for a soul? Just taking a moment here. Feeling how the natural rhythm of breathing is anchoring us without our active doing, and just offering the invitation of 3 breaths. We're taking them in through the nose and out through the mouth. So 3, 2, 1, and in through the nose. And out through the mouth. 2 more, in through the nose. Out through the mouth. 1 more, in through the nose. And out through the mouth. Dear beautiful creation on this day, please facilitate a loving connection between ego and myself. Guide our tongues so we can speak what needs to be said, so we can hear what needs to be heard, we can share what needs to be shared. May we enter this conversation with grace, with love, respect, integrity. May we honor these gifts of life, the nectar that we get to experience every day, the soil we're standing upon, the air in our lungs, the food in our tummies. May we remember those who came before us and those who will come after us. We thank you, we thank you, we thank you. And may we remember that there's nowhere to go and nothing to do. Just now is enough. Thank you. With that being said, just inviting us slowly back into the room, opening the eyes again, letting the light into our awareness. Thanks for doing this with me, Igor.
Beautiful.
So, on this day in Spain for you, what's alive right now for you?
Oh. Everything is alive. Everything. There's nothing more alive than other. So it's just an uninterrupted flow. This inner stream of awareness. Everything is alive. Whatever comes into the focal point of attention of any of the, let's say, preferred, consciously or otherwise, through the organs of cognition, then that's a different story. Then attention is funneled there. Or if the mental process takes a certain direction, again, it's just there. But other than that, everything is in that continued stream. We could call it aliveness, alive to itself. It can just be left without being named as any experience which is seized before the dynamics of subject and object kicks in, is experienced for what it is. And when that is experienced for what it is, then it doesn't require a mental commentary. But of course, if the moment is lost, and inevitably the creative tension rises there, that creates this and that, and creates the experiencer experiencing something. We settle for that too. That's the way of life.
So I'm hearing some chirping of birds in the background.
Yeah, it's early spring, hopefully, fingers crossed. And it's still February, but we're blessed. I mean, it's almost mid-February, but we've got like temperatures well, almost reaching the 20s in the Celsius. So it's like the whole, it's one of my favorite times of the year in Mallorca, because it tends to get very hot here and dry, and in the height of the season, when every holiday maker, house owner, expat flocks to the island. But this is a quieter time, that those moments when island has a very different, it presents one who lives like it takes to live here, to enjoy these outside the season moments. And I learned to like those outside the season, like we've got almond trees now in full blossom in February. So it's, the fields are green already, but it's not yet spring in full sense in Northern Hemisphere. And yet we are spoiled with that. So yeah, the window is open. You'll surely hear a rooster anytime in the background.
So on a day like this, and we're speaking, for the listeners, we're speaking in the late morning time, and you sharing a little bit about that pure awareness that is alive within you. How would a morning like this look for you? Just if you feel like sharing, like the mundane activities of maybe making yourself a cup of tea or coffee or a drink. How would you describe this from a point of, how you started this day, and how that feels through the lens of awareness for you?
Well, it's pretty, I would say, casual, mundane, and I'm a householder. I'm in a committed relationship where we're raising children. We have 3 children together with my wife, Amrita Devi. So if I'm not on the road, if I'm not traveling, then the pace is pretty much determined by the comings and goings, right? The kids get ready for school. The eldest is 17, the middle one, the boy, he's 14, and the youngest is 5. So the morning can be quite lively, and the morning has different phases. Our son goes to school the earliest. The school starts in Mallorca quite early. But I like slow mornings. I like, I don't hurry to the kitchen. I just do my routine, assistant whatever way I can. There's always something to do in the house, obviously. There's always some chores, right? So, as I said, it can be quite sounding almost outside of the spiritual discourse. It's life as usual. It's, loading the washing machine, like going through the stuff, tidying up. Although I like to tidy up as the last one to retire. I like to leave house in as much order as it's possible, because it will be, knowing very well that it will be messed up immediately many times over. So, and then I proceed towards something. Well, yes, I can add that I do take care of myself. I do some morning routine, of course, like all the normal, let's say, hygiene. I do some stretches. I do some exercises. I'm 1 year before reaching 60. I just turned 59. So I like to keep my body fit. So I have my morning set, and depending on the day, some of them more geared towards stretches, maybe more asana-based, some exercises that are used by martial artists for strength in the legs, so that I feel that extra, let's say, lightness in the walk. And at other times I'll do something a bit maybe more challenging. I picked up the kettlebells 5 years ago, just as we've learned that we are pregnant with that unexpected gift of the third child together with my wife. And I thought, damn, I need to kind of like, I would have to be able to carry this baby, to bed, sometimes flies upstairs, carry her on my shoulders, this and that. So I just gone and got myself the kettlebells, which I used when I was much younger. And it's a kind of a part and parcel of the world I grew up. Soviet Union, Russia, Asia, kettlebells, this is where they came from. So I do some exercises with that, or I just do something with my own weight. And then I feel like, now I deserve to put something into my mouth, and I go and I will make a tea, something in the manner of this. And I would make a pot of nice, I would confess, developed taste for good Japanese tea over the years, over the summer. I've been drinking Japanese tea since my mid-20s. So, some 30 years plus. So I would enjoy the tea alone first. Just enjoy the tea, then have something to eat lightly. And that's how my typical day would start. It could be indoors. More likely I would steal myself out, sit outdoors. We have a beautiful vistas, like just even as I speak to you. I looked over the Montuuri Valley, which is kind of known as a breadbasket of organic agriculture in Mallorca. So through the orange grove, into the olive trees, and far into the hills. And because of the nature of this, what I do, of course, inevitably, I would have to give my attention to what needs to be done on a day. So as maybe casual or poetic as it sounds, depending on the take, it's not all that sort of, lost in a dreamland of life I've carved out for myself. There comes a moment, my phone is next to me, and I'm busy doing my work. I'm running an organization with about 25 volunteers who committedly work together for the common good. So there's always something to do, always. So that's how my work will proceed. My day will proceed, and that kind of balanced, let's say, between something that really, really could be easily leaned towards contemplative, and something which basically life of every householder. I may be fortunate enough now not having to run out of the house every day to go somewhere. And I never did that, so I've always did something that implied doing it on my own terms, in my own time, even when I was still an artist, painter living in London. So that kind of tapping into a rhythm that has its own pace, pertinent with my understanding of time, priorities, right? It's like that. So it's fairly straightforward. And of course, when I'm on the road, then it's a very different ballgame. That I'm in a program, I'm in the immersion. I do what required there. So it has a much more, I would say, even disciplined military approach because I need to be as sharp as I could and as soft as I could at the same time. So it would require very different, But when I'm at home, I will get enough kicks here from from various areas. So I try to steal every possible moment when it is just, when this can be either taken for granted or just savored. So just savoring the moment. This is a graceful walk between a contemplative way of life and what requires a constant, let's say, hands down, sleeves rolled up approach.
Yeah. I find it very beautiful, the simplicity to return to for all of us as we, the illusion of advancing on any path and the realization that then drops in to get back to where it all started, aka beginner's mind, come back to very mundane things. And I guess just putting that into question, like when doing these apparently, mundane things, how would you say your perception of them changed over the years, and as you evolved and had experiences in your life that you had and that also, encompass everything that you're doing within your work, how do they affect how you are, in your life right now with people, your children at home? Is there a different, does that differ from, I don't know, 20 years ago or 30 years ago? And if so, maybe how?
That's an interesting question to ponder on, but the truth is, it would be nearly impossible to say how that really is. In retrospect, of course, there's always a way to look back, and if I hear you, where the question itself comes from, that let's say, whether driven by curiosity or inquiry, at a certain point, the references themselves begin to get dissolved. So, yes, of course, if push comes to the shove, if this was, let's say, a panel and some kind of conferential setting where one would have to speak to the audience, where, to relate in that manner where, people want to walk out with something, with some understanding, then I would summon something up and say, well, that prior to, let's say, that moment, and yes, of course, there is always something that served as a landmark. So I could say that before my mid-30s, before, let's say, the dramatic transformation of consciousness that my consciousness underwent, things were distinctively different. And then when going through that process of transformation, which has facilitated, first and foremost, complete and utter realignment of everything, and at some point living in as if falling into the void, which is a very uncomfortable phase, which also makes me now, well, which makes it possible for me to relate to those, let's say, who go through that process themselves firsthand, because it's not based on intellectual understanding, it's not based on even some kind of maybe empathy of how can someone be totally lost. I've lived that from someone who always had certainty, like certainty to the degree which may even sound ridiculous. As a boy, when asked, what are you going to do when you grow up in Soviet Union, something circa 70s, early 70s, right, maybe mid 70s, purportedly that was related to me by my mother, years after, I said, when all the other kids in the family, the cousins gathered around a big table somewhere, family gathering, and like each one would have their turn. Oh, I want to be doctor, I want to be, astronaut, I want to be this, I want to be that. And when my turn came, I said, I'm gonna be a famous artist living in London, or maybe England, I said at the time. This is the time of the, like when the world was divided. This was the time when I don't even know where I came up with that. Like where did it come from? I don't recall that personally, but when my mother related that to me, and it was confirmed by some others, that it was shocking. She had to hide the smile because she thought like I'm completely just like, imagining something. She didn't want to offend me. So she related that to me already when I was in London, busy with my art and artistic career. So I'm saying this as a simple, just like that, let's say, sketch to illustrate the certainty, the certitude. And that certitude pushed me also to extremes of self-exploration, very often selfishly than not pursuing how I would want to express myself. I'm fully acknowledging this. I've acknowledged this years ago, how many people in my direct environment, very close to me, were hurt by my ambitions, my aspirations, the sheer force, for which, of course, I had tons of excuses. I was intelligent, smart, clever, and, of course, smug, because that's what this together comes into inevitably. Developing this self-serving ideology. You see, when you leave people behind, when you break relationships, when you break commitments, when you pursuing relentlessly your own, let's say, bluntly put it, career, interests, and you always have that holy cow, right, as a justification. So when all that was deeply questioned in, let's say, prior to the unfoldment of the main event and what ensued from there, all that certainty was fizzled away. And with that certainty, of course, I was watching the collapse, the deconstruction, demolition of everything I knew about myself. And it was at once fascinating, thrilling, at the very same time, deeply unsettling, at times nothing short of terrifying. So learning to live from a place of total and utter uncertainty had to become a modus operandi in itself, because I got kind of stuck in London, stuck in a sense when this, what I went through, happens to someone who is in the, let's say, monastic, ashramic set, when someone is, let's say, where life is cheap and warm, and it, you don't have to pay the bills and the rent and what have you. It may be different. I don't know. Again, that is a speculation to talk about it. But I was in London, already living a life what some would consider to be a life of a successful, happening guy, artist who lives doing what he loves doing in a very nice area, in a very nice setting. So I could not simply come out even there. There was no life force, energy for me to, let's say, pack it all away and just go somewhere. And so what I'm just trying to bring here simply maybe to make it more, to place this so that it's clearer for anyone who would happen to perhaps hear this conversation. Once going through that process and watching that dissolution of the apparent self, how it had that self-referral point, what came out of that was something else, you see, something else. And what was rising from there, it took a while for it to be fully recognized for what it is. And when that recognition, I would say, dawned, and the years of stabilization and integration that proceeded from there, it was very clear to me that what was considered at some point uncertainty, not knowing, is the very, very way with which nature speaks. It's the language, the very language of nature. It's constantly changing. It's the ever-changing reality. And yet, at the very same time, the rerouting took place. So if I before was rooted in that where we, as it were, draw our aspirations from and consider all our strength comes, was turned upside down and replugged. So when that replugging took place, the aspirations were no longer coming from that what constantly seeks reassurance and certitude, but instead it came from a place of that what is subject to no change, which is ever present, which is, effectively speaking, never changing. So the never changing is the only, one and the only true sense of certainty. And so that became a lived affair. So therefore, that what I said immediately in response to when you have brought this out into the open, the references themselves, you see, the reference, that's a framework of references dissolved in that. So I could not be truly honest to say how that was and how it is, because I would just come up with this or that, you know. I would have to come up with something which would amount for recreating these references, you see? Yeah. And of course, it's not an easy thing, because it can only be applicable where that is clearly, I would say, lived, and yet in the world that multivalent and displays itself in all its shades and colors and variety. Even in my own relationship, even in my own interactions, I cannot exercise that or take that for granted or just assume that that's the case. So the re-entrance into the interactions with the full understanding that what is lived would have to be then applied only in the settings where it is called for. Yeah. So it's like, I often give these examples of theater for many reasons. There are many reasons. It's very, from just straightforward, even, let's say, superficial, to very deep, profoundly deep. It's no surprise that I've referenced theater in my very first book that launched me as an author, The Chamatkara, The Hidden Path. The theater was brought there as the, which stands at the origin of all arts in India, and likewise of all arts in the Western civilization, in its cradle in the ancient Greece. But theater in a sense of us all performing roles in accord with a certain, let's say, written or unwritten, spoken or not, script. So it is knowing the role. So therefore, you can almost tell how green and immature someone's awakening by virtue of how people displayed out there in the world with others. Because if they wear it on their sleeves, it means it's green. You've studied Zen, and from what I understood, you belong very much to that tradition in your own fostering, right? In your own tutoring and training. You know very well that term stinking, right? That so and so stinks of awakening, right?
Yeah.
It's metaphoric, but it's also distinct, right? Because in the phase when awakening is fresh, unloading is accompanied by detoxification. So it is literally stinky, literally. One's underwear, one's garments stink. One's sweat stinks because all the toxins are being released. At a psychological level, it is the phase when all that is being poured out of all one's pores.
Mm-hmm.
So knowing one's role, knowing when there is Shakespearean dialogue and when one is on stage, and knowing when one is off the stage, there's no need to run around and scream the lines, right? It's just like, all right, well, we're in a different setting. So, so that, not sure if that kind of answers directly or not, but to say, how does it feel, how I would have been 20 years ago, is also maybe a certain invitation for certain era, is because what I have tend to now realize more and more that the degree of integration is immeasurable in terms of its subtlety and nuances.
Mm-hmm.
So if at some point I could say, okay, that was a distinctive integration, perhaps integration of the profound shift in identity, and how that was accompanied by, let's say, being able to function. Then there is an integration of a psychic phase, a distinctive yogic phase, particularly if someone is as driven as I was, it will translate naturally, right? There's, someone said, if we are to reference other peers in the field, that it's of no surprise that Adyashanti would make it as a spiritual teacher, right? He was a driven, very competitive biker, right? He was like, in his youth, was very driven. So one can observe that same pattern. If someone is driven, in Sanskrit has a lot of that fire, that tapas. So if that tapas was burning bright outwardly in any field of life, and providing one did not exhaust that flame, that passion, when that gets converted, it converges into a very powerful source of spiritual transformation. So, of course, there was this phase of extreme internal expansion when, I no longer was conquering territories out there, right? And projects, ambitions, right? Like living, pressing my, let's say, I'm here existence into the interactive sphere of where that happens to be, right? Impressing, because that's what we all do. There's this phase in life, we ought to do that. It's our job to impress, leave the imprint, so that imprint then will reverberate. Some beings left such powerful imprint, we still live in the mold that they left behind. Or even if we are to give it a less solid, less calcified example, we live in frequencies, vibrations that these beings left. Whether this is ideologically speaking, whether this is speaking in terms of the repercussions that it left on even down to the geopolitics of the world we live in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's a kind of like each and every one of us, there's a helpful term in Indian spirituality, in Indian culture per se, which can be understood in a variety of ways, right? And there's a term avatar, but there's a term avadhood. And avadhood is the one who has, it serves both for the one who's shaken off the dust, right? Hood is the dust left, powder left of after burning of the incense. It's that the hood. But avadhood is the one who's shaken off the dust. But it is also used with regards to very powerful beings, extremely powerful beings. I can give a very negative example just to maybe as a homeopathic dosage to shake up the listeners a bit. When Ramana Maharshi was told about the Second World War, about the Nazi and the Hitler, what he meant we don't know, but his response shocked some of the people in his environment because some of these people were Brits, Westerners. He said purportedly, well, who knows? Perhaps this Hitler is an avadhood, right? Like he used that epithet. Not many people like to admit that, and of course we're not going to go there. It's beside the point. These are semantics of how we canonize certain beings. We don't want to hear anything that doesn't fit our ideal of idolization. What I meant by this example to illustrate is that this, whatever we are eager to press and leave the imprint, when it is converges, that same very energy begins to expand inwardly.
Mm-hmm.
And it bound to be accompanied by the rise of some psychic phenomena. And it's a very dangerous process. Because just as outwardly, if you give someone power, that's the best test of their humanness, right? The best test of their humanity. If you give someone power, right? That very canonical, very often used, right? The power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. In a sense that when there's no longer desire to express oneself outwardly that much or not so much, then that same very power begins to expand the internal horizons. It begins to push against the internal boundaries where this, canonically speaking, psychic powers begin to manifest themselves. So that's also a very, very peculiar phase.
Mm-hmm.
And I went through that phase. And thankfully, I quickly realized that this force needs to be funneled somewhere. And after certain spontaneously displaying themselves cases of healings that took place in my immediate environment, including some of the people who were very close to me, complete and utter remissions. We're talking about cancer, completely 100% remissions, without me doing anything in a sense of what one does. It simply was a byproduct of my own sadhana. So I gave myself to the practice of pranic healing. I learned all the ethics. I wanted to make sure that whatever excess of that psychic resonance is there, it is funneled somewhere rather than just taking me on its own spin somewhere where it could derail. I was already by then fully aware of the warnings of those who came, the predecessors, the guardians, the keepers of the light, right? That not to mess up with this, not to taper with these powers. So that again, phase of integration, then leaving that, let's say, the being involved in working with healing modalities at a psychic level, at a distance and all the rest of it, and not just in presence. Also, so these different phases of integration, but what came to me is that at some point, fully re-entering the household alive, consciously knowing that I have to be a father. I've lost a daughter when I was very young. My first daughter, which was a fruit of a first love relationship, sweetheart. My first love, someone I knew from the age 15. And the seed was, of course, deeply sown there of unfulfilled fatherhood, the trauma, the tragedy, the agony. So somehow I knew that I would have to re-experience that, live that. And what would that amount is being fully thrown into this, you see. Life in the family is not an experiment. It's not something one can conduct in safety of the, let's say, laboratory, right? And whatever goes wrong, one can always say, well, okay, we'll continue tomorrow, or just maybe wrap it up or curtail this. No, this is it. This is life.
Yeah.
It takes you over, and in no time, it lives through you. It leaves you, rather than you are living it, or whichever way. So then, of course, there were phases already on the road, and coincided with us. When the second one was born, we went to Costa Rica for 2 years, Central America, to completely have that complete departure from everything. Lives in the jungle, on the road, constantly having to live to re-enter as Brits, right? Guatemala, Nicaragua, Panama, trying here, there, see? So coming all the way to where you have introduced that aspect, to me it seems now more than ever that it's an open project. It's a kind of like a work in progress. It has this continuity. It doesn't maybe have the dramatic aspect to it. That I would not pretend. No. It has certainly that what has been expounded on in so many ways by those who have been before us, who came before us, who treaded this path. And once the heavy weight of the luggage has been put down, one knows how it feels. And one would be total fool to become that luggage and place it on one's neck, on one's shoulders. Because one knows how light it feels to have the burden down, to place that burden down. So maybe if we dress down, right, like Zen often likes to dress lofty concepts down, to earth them, to give them back to the reality of, right, chopping wood, carrying water, right, is that it is that very much what feels like it. See, like, we can always have Venusian understanding and reach to the height of philosophical, or pinnacle of the philosophical understanding. Esoteric anatomy is very rich. Like Zen maybe simplifies that, but it's all linked to Tao, and Tao is very intricate, right? And in Indian spirituality is also can be very intricate, can be very down to earth, very simple, or getting away with earth completely, which is another extreme, right? Transcendence and or bust. But somehow that, let's say, if we are to, what is it all about then? Well, as Abhinavagupta said, to those who wanted to know how it feels literally as when putting the heavy weight down that one carried all one's life and suddenly exhaling and feeling unburdened, feeling lighter. So that's a down-to-earth notion of how it feels. So in other words, one would be complete and utter fool to pick up that burden back again, right? So it's like, therefore, there's no drama anymore. There's no dramatic kind of unfoldment, but the subtlety, the intricacy of it is still there, right? Like I didn't know that there was anything for me to learn. I fathered 5 children. My eldest now, who lives in Warsaw, she was born in 1990. So she's fully grown up woman, lady, right? 35-year-old. Then the 2 teenagers and the 5-year-old. When she came into my life, into our family, I was puzzled. What is it that I'm still here to learn? And lessons were plenty. Yeah, so the most what I've learned is how tender one could feel. See, I'm of the age of the grandfather. I'm the eldest guy when I go to pick her up from her preschool. I'm the grayest guy there, right? Some people even inadvertently thought that I'm indeed a grandfather. So, and this is where I find the beauty of that the beauty in the gritty, in the mundaneness. And maybe that's where that continued integration, where this, whatever rises, it's to introduce itself as a reference point and boundaries are only to be dissolved and back into that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Boundless.
Yeah. Many threads in what you shared that I would love to pick up upon, I guess more than this conversation could facilitate. So just feeling into what I feel most drawn to in this moment. So what really resonated personally, and it's like you're really speaking directly to my heart, is the different phases in one's life and its place in one's evolution, and to acknowledge that and to come into harmony with that and not meeting that with the resistance and the imprint that you were talking about, leaving that. I feel like sometimes, like especially when I'm looking back, there was such an eagerness and a cognitive realization of many things, and sort of like ahead of its like embodied integration. And so that needed to sink in over time, and still does now. And it requires me to, like, again and again and again, sort of like come into harmony with where my life is at right now. And I feel in this stage I'm very much in this imprint phase. I'm doing all of these things and projects and initiating myself and things in the world. And I've contemplated this many, many times, also during my monastic times, where I felt and thought especially that I had to withdraw from everything, because that will lead to greater clarity, and that will sort of like purify me of all of these energies that pull me so much into getting up, rising very early, and winding down very late, because my day is just packed of so much force, like driving force of creating, whatever that is. Like I'm looking here at my guitar, I'm thinking about my drums. So like I'm playing music, I'm writing, then I'm doing the podcast, and I'm managing a restaurant, many different things, right? And so to come into harmony with that phase in my life is a journey, and coming back to simplicity, which seems so, in many phases of my life, seemed nearly antagonistic to how I live my life. You know, how can I find simplicity, clarity, purity in all of these different endeavors, you know, that sprout from my being? But it's along the lines of what you shared. It becomes, it can coexist. It doesn't. It's not a contradiction. It is actually the foundation upon which I build all of these things on, you know. And I find this in the pauses in between. And that's what I'm currently working on as well. My biggest pursuit is to pause between these things and to harvest pauses of remembrance and of deep. There's just peace, and there is one word that comes up, which then I will put in a question now, which is surrender. And actually, I wrote this down at the beginning of the conversation as a question to ask. And, you know, usually then I'm becoming present with you, and I never look down again on the sheet. Now with this, it just like, it was funny because that was coming up all this time when you were speaking. I was like, so what role does surrender play in all of this? Like I have my own relationship to surrender, and it encompasses like all facets of my life, and it's like one of the most like foundational pieces where that's basically one of my biggest teachers, because whenever there is this resistance in any aspect of my life, in the relationships I'm entering or not entering, in the pursuits I'm going after, surrender into less resistance, and into, or if there is resistance, surrendering into that, has gifted me with so much. When I'm just looking around here, the life that I created for myself, and the renaissance of like being stripped of so much of my identity, of my ego, like things that were taking away. And that was all, I'm referring to a point in my life 2 years ago where the only and first relationship I was in, that was dissolving very suddenly after 7 years, very suddenly. And then so was my job, and therefore my home. So my physical, the flat that we were sharing together. So all of these external things were just dissolving, and so I was left with this deep contemplation and this quest of surrendering into the unknown, and what was birthed from that, which now manifests around me when I'm just looking at this room, which is now my home, is nothing short of amazing, nothing short of beautiful. So surrender has gifted me so much, and it needed to be. It's a constant. It requires. It's like a plant I'm sort of like getting acquainted with, and I'm like, oh, I think it needs watering now. Okay, and now it actually needs nothing. It needs not my active it knows what it's doing actually. All the information is in the seed, in the sapling that's in the earth. It requires maybe my presence right now. And this dance has been going on ever since, this relationship, ever-evolving relationship to surrender in my life. So I would love to hear your whatever comes through, also in regards to what you've shared and your relationship to surrender. and what that has meant for you in your life.
Well, perhaps it would be also fitting if we actually look into the concept of surrender, the term itself, what it carries, in a sense that, of course, it's been used in spiritual language with regard to so many areas, with regard to, and also from various different perspectives. But I maybe would like to make a certain emphasis on what do we understand by surrender, and where surrender perhaps more in terms of acceptance of, let's say, what otherwise we are prone to reject or create certain opposition to. So, and there are overlapping territories, of course, but there are subtleties that what makes surrender into, what makes true surrender into what it is versus acceptance. And of course, without acceptance, there's no surrender, right? That's also they are interrelated here. Of course, they are words, just helpful, let's say, pointers in the language to what always somehow is more difficult to pinpoint. So let's look into this, and then I would perhaps give my own understanding in terms of how this is experienced here with regard to how I have learned to, let's say, accept and go with the flow of what inevitably will take place anyway, irrespective. So this is one of the interesting and I think very important realizations that should happen sooner or later to anyone who is honest about their intentions to live life from a place of what it meant to be lived. And even though there are various different perspectives of what life is, whether it has a meaning, whether meaning is inherently in itself is part of the mental concept, and a life itself is meaningless in the sense of what we understand by meaning, that we add meaning simply by virtue of necessity to feel that somehow our life has a purpose, because without meaning, then it pulls out the carpet beneath that what also serves here as a purpose. So the whole thing can just get into a big mess. And we see this in our culture today. We see that it's a civilizational, I think it's one of the civilizational dilemmas that as we, without a shadow of a doubt, all live in the very, very dusk of the current civilization, at the very end of the civilizational unfoldment. We're witnessing this first and foremost deterioration of that what always serves as a cohesiveness in any given civilization and culture. That cohesiveness that unites us without us having to kind of go into the spiritual retreats and read spiritual books or to understand how everything is interconnected, because that is done by a shared purpose. And that shared purpose is no longer there. The deconstruction of ideas is what postmodernism is characterized by. Deconstruction of the very notions that served before. And at the very same time, the older systems that outlive themselves, they cannot serve as this something that binds everything together by virtue of giving that sense. So we are left here, I'm saying we, and this is a very, very big question for younger generations now, because, well, simply by virtue of the digitization of everything, and how that is at the expense of potential and gradual and progressive dehumanization, because it gives an idea as if we are connected, whilst in fact it is at the expense of being utterly and entirely disconnected. So this is the downside of this digital age that brought these devices that made everything at the click of a finger, swipe of a finger rather, makes everything so much easier in a sense, instant, accessible, also brings the tremendous sense of variety, multiple points of view, right? I'm just bringing it all in here because I don't want just, because this is all interconnected. So the surrender that you're asking to reflect on how I see and understand this is all interconnected to the acceptance, to the meaning or lack of thereof, and purpose likewise. So we are in the precipice of very, very, very interesting time, because some say, and their perspectives that have been already, they are as old as 100 years. There have been figures who have been speaking about civilizational consensus in itself heralds the calcification and the end of any given shared ideological setup. Doesn't matter if there are conflicting ideologies, let's say communism versus capitalism. It doesn't matter. They're all byproduct of the same culture. They're all byproduct of the same culture. After all, the ideas of Marx could be seen as stripped from religious background Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonism itself is also Abrahamic traditions given philosophical spin for the masses. That's what, no, sorry, the other way around. Pardon me, the other way around. The Abrahamic truths and revelations are for the masses, but Neoplatonism is for those who would like to have a more refined food, more refined understanding. So the spin of all that into the different class system and the antagonism, it belongs to that same thing. It's like in the United States, Republicans or Democrats are but theatrical slogans, theatrical kind of parties. They don't mean anything. Yesterday's Democrat can be today's Republican, vice versa. There are shared territories and goals, and after all, it's not a rocket science to figure it out and realize that this is a charade. If one would be part of it, fine. But if one wakes up from that, one doesn't want to be part of it. One realizes that there is only one way is to enter one's sovereignty. There's only true way is to enter one's sovereignty. And this is where I feel the understanding of surrender is inseparable from. Because our sovereignty, the true sense of who we are, is inseparable from that what surrender here represents. Because what we're surrendering here the pseudo notion of what usurped our sovereignty in the first place. And the expense is tremendous. The trading has been so viciously done. It literally turns one into a slave, no matter what social status he or she belongs, or what one fancies oneself to be. And of course, the perennial traditions and the great beings of the past and present, the sages, the philosophers, have been saying the same thing over and over. So that trading the pure, priceless diamond for a bunch of spinach is a kind of is a proverbial thing. So the surrender here can be seen in therapeutic terms, right? Purely therapeutic terms applicable to people who, well, simply suffering one way or another. Suffering from something. Doesn't matter. Life inevitably is a suffering. Sukha dukkha, right? Everything is just two sides of the same coin. So the understanding that everything follows and there's a dependent origination sooner or later leads to the understanding that brings clarity. And when that clarity dawns, of course, one begins to come out of the doldrum. But for a lot of people, suffering is the only option. And that suffering, of course, requires the therapeutic application of surrender to introduce the possibility for some space, for some spaciousness, for self-repair to begin. Because by virtue of how everything is in nature, as you have said, rightly so and very, very poignantly so, is that the life of the plants, a prime example of how everything functions. It's in the DNA and it's in the seed. It is already programmed. So given whatever favorable circumstances, it will cut through the concrete. It will reach to the light. It will open its petals. It will come up in flowers. This is the way of flora. This is the way nature speaks her language, through plants, right? This is like a great, massive, cosmic inhalation and exhalation, right? So the oxygen can be generated on the planet Earth over millions of years of evolution, so that the first primitive organism can come and inhale, right? So this is the way the nature itself works here, right? That grand project of creating the possibility for the oxygen to be here in the first place. So plants, I love that you brought it in. So for many people, surrender is like the first step for self-healing, for recovery. Without it, it's a continued invasion, a continued aggression, continued struggle because of all that, what follows each other here. So we can see that how it is particularly played itself out when terminally ill, I'm giving this as a conscious example, terminally ill, when death sentences are issued by medical establishment and people have no choices. Because one thing is certain here is that certainty of being born followed by certainty of death. And that certainty of death simplifies things there and then. So one have no choice but to surrender. So therapeutically speaking, surrender here is that what has to be rewoven into the cultural consensus. Cultural consensus. It's like literally, I don't know. The problem is it cannot be taught in school, right? It's not something one can add into the curriculum, but it is inevitable and absolutely indispensable part of being alive. And ultimately speaking, surrender is the very portal, the doorway, the passage, the initiation into re-entering into one's sovereignty. So it is this unsurmountable level of energy that is required to generate for that trading to take place when one offers oneself utterly and entirely, because the sovereignty here that we speak of is not the sovereignty of an individual. This is a big, big misleading pointer. It can only lead to further entanglement through aggrandizement in our culture. And we now came to a precise moment in time when these ideas and ideologies met its dead end. The worst thing, of course, is that the slogan and the umbrella of liberal democracy is now changing into nothing short of the potential fascism and totalitarianism is a natural outcome, we could say, or suggest, of where individuality or the like, right? Frankly, what's the highest aspiration behind the ideas of liberal democracy? It's rooted in noble aspirations of the ancients, in the Greeks, the idea of the demos. And what's the idea of the demos? It's taken its natural conclusive phases in the modern day and age by those fathers who have coined out all this, even the language itself, in terms of what liberal democracy meant to represent, is the climate and the atmosphere in the society where each individual can express themselves to their full potential. But yet that is taken only at the face value, at the superficial surface horizontal value. So the individuality is only sliding, skimming the surface and nothing else. No vertical dimension to our individuality is introduced. So what we're chasing here, our own tail. And so surrender is, without surrender, and the surrender as a conscious act, where one cannot surrender oneself fully and entirely, it's impossible. Simply impossible. It's like trying to jump out of one's own skin. So therefore, in some certain traditions, like let's say just for variety's sake, in Sufi language, surrender here becomes a very leitmotif, right? When one literally offers back the traces of what one considered erroneously to be one's own into the ocean of being, right? This confluence is a continued confluence, just as a river flows into the ocean. It doesn't exhaust itself. It's a continued process. It's not just like once I'm float into the ocean, I'm done. I'm now the ocean. It's understood to be this a very way of life. Yes, there would be some colossal figures who would stand within a given culture. They would become the exemplars, whatever, Sufi mystics, poets, who would be standing there as the perhaps confirmations of that it is not all in vain. But it cannot be just, the tradition cannot sustain itself on just few examples. It has to have that what brings solace to all its members, right? This is irrespective whether this is Hindu, Zen, Tao, it has to serve. We cannot just have one mystic here every 100 years and everyone else goes starving. So this understanding of the confluencing is there so that one constantly surrenders. One surrenders, one finds oneself in whatever there is, that there is still carries these traces, and one surrenders that. And then one goes with that, and there is this flow. And then one finds oneself again that becomes more rigid. Okay, that there is something else to surrender. There's more to surrender. So acceptance, of course, is often spoken today, and I'm not alluding somehow, presuming that you speak of surrender as, but today, in today's conversations, often one can find that surrender is used in a more kind of, I would say, diluted way, which maybe more accurately put is an acceptance of one's situation, acceptance of one's predicament, acceptance of how things simply are.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily a surrender. Acceptance is the first step, but surrender is something else, right? That acceptance has something like, okay, I can see I'm no longer resisting that because I can see it's futile. Okay, I cannot do anything about it. Very often acceptance is done totally and utterly post factum. We accept because there's no other way. So there's nothing of us accepting anything in fact. It's just happened already. So whether one admits acceptance or not is beside the point. Whereas surrender is much more active. There is a flow in surrender. Mm-hmm. There's even in the underlying timbre of the word that it invokes, it has this quality of heart-based glow, warmth. No, like there's this sense of more than just, let's say, okay, yes, I cannot do anything about it.
Yeah.
Right. I ought to just let it happen or accept this, So yeah, spiritual surrender is an ultimate surrender. That surrender is what renders us into what we could have not ever imagined. Something along the lines.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that distinction. And I feel like it's a very nuanced, subtle, beautiful contemplation. And everything that you have offered is very nuanced. And I like that. It's beautiful. And I feel like it's missing in a lot of less sophisticated sort of ways of looking at it and addressing this topic, because just to offer like a frame that helped me very much to distinct the different stages of what is, in my opinion, leading to a surrender. That stems from the I Ching and stems from the Gene Keys and Richard Rudd and his transmissions, is that of when working with the shadow and working with resistances that are living within us, allow, accept, embrace. So this is a journey, And even before acceptance, there is an allowance. And that is really not an active doing, and it gets more active as we go along, as you were exactly sort of referring to. So it's just allowing. Can I just allow? And then once, you open this door to whatever you're feeling, whatever there is to be surrendered to ultimately, it needs allowance. And from the allowance, there stems the acceptance, which is already a little bit more of at least that's a feeling I have, at least a little bit more of an active, has an active component. And with the accepting, we're paving the way to eventually like an embrace. But that's advanced. I feel like when I'm looking at personal wounding, embrace seems sometimes very distant. Embrace seems insurmountable at the beginning. It's like I'm at allowing right now. I'm at allowing. I'm not even accepting. I'm allowing. And then as you walk, then it's like, okay, it's acceptance. Really, it's acceptance of the fact that, and I love that. I love the connection to sovereignty that you brought in here. I'm accepting into, and that is then empowering. I'm accepting, and therefore I get empowered into my sovereignty, which is the necessity for anything further. So if we're talking about embracing, integrating, or like full surrender, I need to be sovereign. I need to be in my sovereignty. I need to be in my power to even consider doing anything along those lines. So when it comes to the embrace, I'm like, and I feel like that's intertwined with the surrender as I feel it within me in my journey. I'm like, when I'm hugging, when I'm embracing, when I'm fully like welcoming it, which is very active. So that's actually, it's very similar to martial arts, right? Sometimes when you're facing the confrontation, it's like you're not escaping, but you're actually leaning, even like you're leaning in, you're sometimes leaning in, you're getting closer to a punch, right? And you're really looking at it, right? And you're leaning in, and then you're like avoiding it, or you're working with it, right? It's not like a withdrawal. You're actually moving towards it. You're moving towards what you're like running from sometimes. But that needs, like I said, all of the previous steps. And then that beautiful, it's like my physiotherapist actually told me that analogy when she was working on my lower back, and then she's applying the resistance, and I can feel resistance in my body to what she's doing. I don't want to let go, right? I'm holding on, I'm tensing up. And she's like gently, she steadily applies the pressure, and then she talks me into it, and we're both like on this journey basically of like watching my body allow, accept, and then with the embrace, the tissue relaxes and it softens, and it goes into this flow, what you said. And also what I so much love about what you shared is that is a continuous thing. It's a repetitive thing, and it'll accompany one for a prolonged period, like 4 of our lives, with different things that we encounter, that we face, right? It's like I've surrendered to this, when we're talking about life's stages, right? And I wrote down here grief, that also played a part in your personal journey, right? Like, I guess, surrendering to that seems far from when that originates, like when that comes up at first. And so I guess it requires this very nuanced conversation about these topics. Otherwise, it's just a very superficial very, maybe provocative way of like, embracing this and that and surrendering to this and that. It's like, all right, well, yes, and from also now my teacher Michael Singer, who is like really big on surrender, what I also gleaned is that surrender can be incredibly active, can be incredibly proactive, and can be interactive. Like, it's sometimes the surrender to something higher than me looks like standing up, looks like actually resisting to wrongdoings of, I don't know, just very practical, like people harming other people, like, harm being done, a surrender to resistance of like, actually, I want to withdraw from this situation because it's very making me uncomfortable, but actually surrendering to something that is larger than this for the greater good and also into my sovereignty would be to stand up and to actually say something, or, get physical in between something or whatever it is. That's just an example, but I'm just saying that surrender is actually not just waving the white flag and giving up or anything along those lines. It can be incredibly physical or like active. It can be an act of great.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it could also, just to chime into this, with an example to creative processes, surrendering fully to a creative flow in itself is can be terrifying, where the creativity can take one. That in itself is not a placid affair, right? Like surrendering, this is where this definitely expresses itself in a very, very active way when we surrender into the flow of creative outpouring and where that takes us. Because the true creative process always a reflection of the process of manifestation. In other words, all this, what we share, this partake in this reality, is a creative outburst. And there are many philosophical, metaphysical perspectives that deal with that with precision, how the process of manifestation, the process of how the Absolute expresses itself, is mimicked, reflected through all these activities that we are partaking, whether this is a quiet act of making tea, right? Not just pouring boiled water into a mug and adding some milk and sugar, but actually where it is on par with something happening here. It doesn't matter if tea is drunk every single day. It cannot be made mindlessly. That's the very opposite of the whole tea culture. Or whether one creates something in a movie, a documentary, a film series, that one can follow. There's so many, writing processes, like people who throw themselves in a foray of creative process, that is a surrender. Surrender into something where one is taken over by the power which is greater than, let's say, what otherwise expresses itself on a daily basis as So yeah, that it's very much could be and is an active process.
Yeah. And I love that, you're speaking from that as well, given your personal context and history, working as an artist, which, I feel like it would even be a whole different and a separate conversation. I would love to explore this with you one day. I feel like it's part of this conversation that would I feel like it needs to be addressed separately, but you can I can feel that this is something that you're not talking about it as a knowledge, but you're talking from it as an experience. So it's very powerful and palpable for me. I would love for another pillar of this conversation to have you share with us a little bit of so the context of that is that I'm very much involved with working with men on their path, and I feel like there's a huge renaissance of a conversation what that even means today, manhood and the qualities of masculinity and the whole the energetic energetic meaning and significance within oneself, as in masculine and feminine, and how that affects the way we are in the world, and like it has actually not much to do with gender. It has so much to do with the energies present. And so, given that that's how I discovered you, I would just love to open up a space for you to share a little bit about what I've so much resonated with when you're speaking about the Dharma of men that we are carrying, and what does that mean, or what does it mean today to be a man? And given the word duty that comes up there, that I've heard you speak about, I would just love to open up some space in this conversation for you to share a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, it's a huge topic. Huge topic. It's not an easy one as well, because inevitably, if we are to allow ourselves to speak our heart, our mind, it will affect, impact, and offend someone. So this is very clear, because we live in times of the aforementioned postmodern phase, where these so-called pluralistic ideas of what it means to be alive today and what it means to express oneself fully, because of, again, aforementioned, let's say, superficial understanding of what individual freedom truly comprises of, brings continued fragmentation of the essences. And this is always at the expense of disillusion of that, what effectively speaking meant to be maintained. And this is not an easy discussion, because one can be immediately held accountable for either being, let's say, unapologetically somehow propaganist of the patriarchal ideas, because it is also true that we're coming of the very long age where the roles of the gender, the roles, societal roles, have been at the expense of causing tremendous suffering to both genders, inadvertently. And because of the modern approach that heralds and exalts that individual freedom for self-expression, that goes as far today as allowing teenagers to choose their gender before the psychological maturity of any kind is in itself a sign of our time, where a 10-year-old, 11-year-old can, effectively speaking, navigate the destiny of whom they want to be, which will, of course, inevitably bring a whole army of totally lost, disillusioned, confused, and utterly thrown on the, well, almost like a roadkill, or just simply thrown at the periphery of what otherwise here meant to also beautifully and I'm trying to find fitting terms so that for those for whom this matters don't end up with some hastily made conclusions, because I don't want to exclude anyone from this conversation. I don't want it to begin to sound exclusive as a club. But what here inevitably is the fact that we hear expressions of nature in a way that we come into this world in a certain gender, and I will speak now in a moment to the differences, let's say, that inevitably create that what came also historically as this or that movement, which when this is not understood and does not have vertical dimension, will inevitably turn out to contribute to separation and continued and only contribute and add into the so-called war of the genders. Let's take feminist movement. The premises upon which feminist movement was rising, was built, the momentum and everything, is inseparable from the whole phase and era of awakening from the indoctrinations and from that phase of the utmost, let's say, aggressive phase of colonialism, where masses were waking up from the centuries of indoctrination, where people were divided into masters and slaves, superior races and inferior races, where people were divided by the color. And of course, the rise of the feminism is inseparable from that. It had this, it was united by that same very, very force that was rising from the gutter of life, rising from the very bottom. But in my understanding, and I could be wrong, my understanding could be partial here. I would add this as a confession. But the feminist movement was hijacked. It was hijacked very early on by certain, let's say, tendencies within the society, within the cultural strata of the society, where inevitably it went into the criticism and ultimately destruction of the family, because women were seen as being enslaved by the notions of the family. That notion of the motherhood itself was discarded by some of the most, let's say, active and radical representatives of the feminist movement. So it was literally against the very, very canonized, and it was used in that very way, image of Madonna with child, right? That the image of the mother and child. So like seen through the eyes of the feminists, those who were radically oriented, the Madonna in child or the mother in child in itself was seen as usurping the freedom of a woman to express her aspirations and confining her into just that. This was a devastating blow, and effectively speaking, utterly and entirely a throw as a throw against the language of the nature itself, a throw against what nature itself, the language of the nature. And it comes as no surprise that when it comes to that polarization, this tension within the societal norms, acceptances, and pushing against the boundaries, of course, a lot of it has to do with the economics and social statuses. We shall touch upon that perhaps in a moment as well. But sooner or later, it was inevitable that men would be kicked in the groin there and then for, effectively speaking, being held accountable for that, like creating a deep tension within the members of male community, that they somehow carrying that guilt, and therefore it propelled by further polarizing the society towards these generations of men who simply did not even know what is means to be a man, whilst at the very same time the extremes of its expression begin to display itself in more and more acute manner. So that conflict which, effectively speaking, was all brought onto the horizontal plane, would display itself in that where masculinity will be understood in very primitive terms of how it would display itself, let's say, in that a primal man, this primal man, right? Wild primal man. Whether this is like a Tarzan or Terminator, right? In a sense of the actor that played that, the bodybuilding, all this, the masculinity would be seen through only the form. And of course, it's all within the cultural context. What was in fact happening is complete and utter departure from a much more harmonious understanding of what each gender plays in the cosmic drama of creation, how each one of us here are the embodiment of the eternal cosmic principles. The principle of masculinity and the principle of femininity here is an expression of these polarities that are embracing perpetually. And out of that embrace, everything comes out. So that embrace contains in itself the deepest Atma's transcendence, and at the very same time, the procreation of the world as we know it, because it carries and is empowered by the very, very polarities that the masculine and the feminine here represent, and how that is reflected in our psyche. Our psyche is forever split until the union or reunion, the sublimation of masculine and feminine energy begins to take place. Without that sublimation, one lives, as it were, limping into either of its sides. So this is very well known in the spiritual discourse, obviously, but it is not known out there in the popular discourse. So what I have observed personally is this discrepancy that among the spiritually oriented folk, when this is not understood, then sooner or later it will begin to show itself in a way as a shortcoming. So this analogy, let's say, what caught your attention out there, let's say the term spiritual samurai is something which was coined out about 12 years ago. I don't know if it happened to be used somewhere in a different context by someone. Ideas are there to be picked, tuned into. But I certainly used it. I've used it there and then. Funny enough, just as a commentary, just as a passing note, that those who least embody that principle immediately were easy on the go to pick up this as a slogan and introduce into the vernacular, into the social media. This was almost bizarre, paradoxical, that how that term was hijacked and used left, right, and center by those who would otherwise, I would say, still have plenty of, forging to do. Forging, working on themselves. So the crisis of masculinity is just another side of the crisis of the femininity. And the conversations of the rise of the divine feminine, the rise of the feminine, also coincided with that very same time, where the misunderstanding was, because it was hijacked again by prevalent ideas that were in the cultural discourse. So somehow women felt they are more privileged and more or closer to the divine feminine because of their gender. Whereas to me it was very important that the understanding has to here be rooted in the fact that masculine and feminine principle is what transcends our genders there and then. That we all carry them in equal measure. We must. How it expresses itself then, this is where it becomes interesting, fascinating, and at the very same time where the keeping in line with these gender roles are important if one wants to walk this path with integrity. Because it's very easy to muddle it all up, mix all the apples and pears, and just kind of like, effectively speaking, finding perfect excuses to be exempt for any otherwise spiritual, above all else, responsibility. So this is what, even in the earlier days, I was pointing out in any given occasion, when a conversation will come around that what we speak of as rise of divine feminine is equally applicable to men and women alike, irrespective of where they are, irrespective of what is happening in their lives, because this is a universal principle. It's the principle of creatrix. It's a principle of creativity, cosmic creativity, that universal principle. The fact that the patriarchal systems in most of the religions of the world have that emphasis does not undermine for a moment the aliveness of that energy at all times. It's a kind of fitting, maybe a certain discourse, certain conversation to add and maybe spice it up, But the fact is, no matter how patriarchal, let's say, this or that system was, the mover and shaker is always that divine feminine. And that divine feminine would become more acutely expressed through this or that, through arts above all else. This is where the Shakti, the power of the divine feminine, will pour itself out profusely. And that's how it will find its expression. It will express itself from the tongue of the poet, through the song and the sonnet. It will express itself through the mystic. It will express itself through the sage and the sibyl. It will always be there. It cannot be not. But where we find ourselves, of course, in this continued polarization in the various aspects and spheres of life, in that so-called pluralism of ideas, where everything goes for the sake of, well, that's the personal freedom. Fine. As long as it doesn't create a collateral damage to our society at large. Because these teenagers, those who are in that tender age now, when they're given this open visa, open invitation to taper with the, these superficial notions of what it means to be someone, the emphasis is completely misdirected. So what we will end up with is a generation of lost, utterly lost people, not knowing what they came here to do and what they are. Therefore, to me, sometimes it's like in amidst of a spiritual discourse, amidst of the refinement of all this conversation, purely, let's say, has this esoteric dimension. Spade should be called a spade and bring it out clearly in unapologetic terms. Man's essence is expressed through spirit, and every man here is the carrier of that, a carrier and the reminder. That's the role of the Father and the Son. And the Holy Spirit here represents the divine feminine. That's the Trinity. So every woman here is an expression of that principle. So to remove the maternal principle from a woman is basically to abort the very, very culture that nourishes all its aspects and facets. It's literally throwing the baby with the bathtub water. So it is a continued, intricately intertwined conversation between what it means to be a man today and what it means to be a woman. Because with this, the way of life, the way of this globalization, with the digitation, with the way where roles are much less defined in terms of the actual reality of everyday life, it is no longer defined by, let's say, I have to saddle a horse and, and be off to defend the land, and someone needs to stay behind and tend to the eldest and the youngest, is no longer there. But the archetypal forces are still there. The archetypal forces still speak through us. These very archetypal forces, what displays and speaks itself, you see? When they are withered away, then we forget what we are here for. And for men, the duty here is the very, very matter of being a man. It is being one's life lived in alignment with the highest integrity. So, of course, these masculine qualities here are inseparable from the strength of the spirit. And of course, the state of the body translates into that, because spirit cannot be in the body that is given to indulgences and given to disease and decay. It has to be maintained. It has to have these aspects which is simply a matter of physical and mental hygiene. So, but of course, these conversations are prone to be crushed at the shore of ignorant understanding of, and people will easily hold one accountable for misogyny and for all that old kind of conversation that we pulled into that direction. So you mentioned this, and it's something that is dear to you because you feel the affinity and somewhere where you feel also called to contribute and in that discourse and this discussion, conversation. It's a very big topic.
Yeah.
Very big topic because it's as simple as that. I mentioned this now perhaps more often in the same vein, in the same context, is that the archetype of the masculine archetype could be, it has been already defined as the archetypes, right? The king, the sage, the warrior, the lover. All of them are different aspects and facets of the mature masculinity. The opposite of that is the clown, is the adolescent, right? Like the opposite
Tyrant.
of that is that what stands in opposition to the really the very backbone of what healthy masculinity is represented by. So the warrior is an important aspect here, it's one of the 4 pillars. And the warrior here as a class has been demolished. The faceless soldier is not the manifestation of the warrior. It's not the same. Warrior was a class. Warriors were nobility, whether this is Knight of Templar or Samurai or Kshatriya. They carried a distinctive function in the society. They were upholding the very duty. They were the ones who would uphold righteousness. And for that, one would be ready to give one's life in an instant. Instant. It's not just like something, can I think about it? No, there's no thinking about it. Already passed. It's brought in the fostering, in the forging. So this is why this becomes almost like, this is an archaic conversation. I've heard these comments very often. People like, this is a very primitive understanding. Because, yes, maybe because given to social media treatment, bits and pieces and fragmentation and taken out of context. Therefore, I'm taking this as a chance to give this a broader, wider context so as to embed that in the understanding that it's not just warrior. It is also a poet. It is also a sage. And the king, that's the sovereignty. Each and every one of us carries that as a man. Each and every one, doesn't matter whether this was the king who would tend to his own, let's say, livestock, as in the ancient Greece, or in the old-time island. It doesn't matter. It's the same, that kingship. But the warrior aspect is particularly troublesome because there's no way to display itself today. And going pumping iron or even doing martial arts, it's not quite the same as what the warrior spirit truly represents. Therefore, in my work, it's always an invitation to embrace these qualities and contemplate on that. Is there ideals in my life for which I'm ready to give my life without thinking twice about it? If not, I'm not fully living. Call me a dinosaur, call me a dying breed. I don't care. To me, this is very clear. At some point, this became as clear as a daylight, as sharp as the blade that is forged to do the job. It became very clear that these are not the matters to tamper with and to kind of like put them aside when it doesn't fit our narrative. So sometimes reevaluating this and knowing that there have to be some ideals, and not just ideals and ideologies. It's like, I don't want to make this into kind of like a personal kind of, pumping up this, but I do remember this again, even in my childhood. I once told my mother that I love my friend so much that I can die for him. And I don't know where it came from. Where does it come from? Where does it come from? Somehow, innately, it felt to me that this was the measure of a true friendship. So there must be people in our life for whom we will lay our life instantaneously. And of course, needless to say, there are many of us out there like that. Without a blink of an eye, will commit an act of sacrifice if push comes to shove. So it's not that belittling somehow the time we live in. No, it's actually asking more of us today than perhaps in the era when it was clearly defined, when everyone was carrying a sword because that's the part of the belonging to the societal structure. It's more difficult. You can't carry a sword now. So therefore that sword has to be somewhere else. It translates into these principles we live by and for. That's what, in my understanding of what it means to be a man. And one needs to rise to that every single day. Not, oh, today I fancy myself, right? Or today I don't feel quite, no, that's not the case,
Yeah.
right? I give you examples of great performers just to give us from, let's say, overly militaristic, this kind of samurai. I've learned recently that this dance I've always admired all my life. Rudolf Nureyev, he was the great ballet dancer who defected to Russia back in the Soviet days and became the epitome of what the ballet is. He was gay in his orientations. Some say bisexual, but he was gay, mostly known for. But he had all these qualities of warriorship and living his dharma fully. For example, he performed once with a high fever because he was with pneumonia on stage. The dance, which requires athleticism, which can only be compared to, Olympic sports. He did not budge. He performed that role because this was on a day he could not dare to let his partners and the company down. You see? This is an example. This is an example that, it's not on Monday I fancy myself a warrior. The rest of the week I'll take it easy. Right? So it's very easy to take it easy. Life is almost conducive to that.
Yeah.
Given we are not in the parts of the world where death is, again, a daily feature. It's remote. It's like birds chirping. Life is easy. Okay, this problem, that. But overall, So it's a big topic.
Yeah.
Maxi, it's a big topic, man. So.
Yeah. Thanks for speaking on it and taking it where you felt intuitively it needed to be taken. And I appreciate like you say, the broader scale that we were able to create for this matter and still it's just a fraction of what can be said about it, for sure, but that's within the limitations that we all have in space and time. I feel like, yeah, it needed some addressing, and there's many topics and points where I feel personal resonance with, and I guess when it boils down to is what comes from the inside and what comes from the outside, what is external, what is noise, what is opinions and narratives that are being fed to us, and what is an internal innate knowing. And I feel like that comes down to what you and I were sharing and talking about at the very beginning of this conversation, is the disconnect. And there lies the cure, in my opinion, to much of this insecurity and disorientation, by reconnecting to oneself and the wisdom that we all carry innately within us, completely, irrespective of gender. The energies present will speak to us in a very clear way. I always say that, like, my personal initiation took place in October 2023, and I remember traveling to Los Angeles for a very big men's gathering, and we started off the days with 300 men on a field, and praying and doing like some exercises, like activating our bodies, and leaving this field. No one ever needed to tell me what it means to be a man. Nobody ever would need to tell me how to treat a woman or a child or an elder. That was an innate knowing. That was a deeply embedded, ingrained wisdom that I could feel, and that was coming from me. And I felt more connected to my father than I ever have, and to my twin sister, and to my friends, and to my mother, and to my grandmother and my grandfather. It was just all there for me to, like, it was such a rich well of knowing that I was connected to. And that is something that I wish for many people, like an experience where they once can just like feel that aliveness. And yeah, and it can all be explained. It all is, everything that happens around us, right, is a logical consequence of all the forces that made it to be this way. Obviously, that's physics, literally. We can all unravel that and trace it back, like why things are the way that they are. And then there's just an undeniable truth in experiencing, and that is what you, in my opinion, and what I could feel is what you were alluding to, is something that goes beyond a social media post or like a voice of someone that is talking about a subject, and just pointing a little bit more towards like running it through your own system in the purest sense of the word, right? And letting that just like for once take an initiative to be exactly what you said, not that lazy in the sense of, or comfortable, maybe a more appropriate word, to come up with your own your own interpretation, and I feel like that comes also back to so many different threads here, to the sovereignty. I feel like sovereign, grounded individuals can make choices from that place, and we can remember this knowing. We can pull from this data pool that lives within us, but it requires spaces like this, like a conversation. It needs people maybe that facilitate the space for us, obviously the biggest space that we can go into is nature, I feel like, and it's already there, and it can be observed beautifully there, and especially when it comes to all of these traits, the lover and the sage and the warrior and the king, it can be observed everywhere. Like these are archetypal structures, right, woven within our DNA. So yeah, just grateful for us to have explored this within what's possible in a conversation like this through spoken word. So appreciate this. All right, so landing this plane here slowly. I would like to, introduce some lightness by asking you, like, what brings you joy these days, Igor?
Oh dear. Oh, what brings joy? Well, there's so many aspects in this life, in my life as I live it now, that is filled with so much joy, right? So a lot of these joys are reflections of the joy that is innate. So I don't want to kind of like avoid answering this in a simple way, but if I have to, then of course there are plenty to enjoy. But I don't want to confuse anyone out there that because of, let's say, the setting, the circumstance, I'm surrounded by beautiful people. I'm surrounded by loving family. Like, it's enough to just hear something my 5-year-old daughter says, even not to me, to her siblings, to her mother, to her friends, and that just fills my heart with joy. Sometimes just laughter brings, just burst out of the sweetness, of cuteness of it, But it's also, it's a very demanding to be a parent. It's very demanding, tiring, and it requires a lot of constant attention. So the joys come from so many areas, interacting with what is familiar or less familiar. We live in a beautiful place, Mediterranean, right? So there are so many external factors here that reflect that internal joy back. So therefore, I'm struggling to just like pinpoint what brings joy to me, because a lot of things bring joy to me. A lot of things, like picking up, let's say, what I left somewhere and needs to have my attention. That brings me joy. Leaving things aside and just being able to say, well, I don't have to do it now, also gives me joy. You see, just day to day, this, enjoying one's favorite meal, enjoying one's favorite time of the day, right? That these moments that inserted into, encrusted, see, that creates that overall, that beautiful pattern. See, that this is all like, I cannot, yes, of course, if you put me on a spot, well, is it all just uninterrupted joy? And of course I would not lie. No, of course it is. Therefore I'm saying it's encrusted, inserted into what otherwise there's, business as usual, going about, doing what needs to be done. Job needs to be done, right? So it's like business need to be taken care of, right? Responsibilities need to be faced. So all this, of course, there's a predisposition of how to do that. Sometimes rubber hits the road so hard, you can smell it, right? But what brings me most joy, I cannot answer that. it would not be true. See, what gives me most joy? I can say, well, what feels maybe in the moment, perhaps would feel as the most joy. But is that true or not? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So therefore, I prefer to, in this case, be a bit more evasive, if you don't mind.
Totally fine. And what are you looking forward to?
Oh, well, in purely, let's say, pragmatic, practical terms, I'm looking forward to just whatever this adventure leading to. We have initiated our now plans with the physical center on the ground. So we, as an organization, as a community, making first steps towards that, which is going to be, of course, very, very big in the making, long project. There are programs that I'm always looking forward to, all live events, because it never ceases to amaze me, surprise me, encourage me with the novelty of it. So I always look forward to, and I have it all lined out already for the coming months, whole year already fully outlined. I'm looking forward to completing this second project, my second book, dedicated entirely to the Kundalini, both as a symbol and as a process, which we planning to launch sometimes, hopefully end of the spring. So there's a master training program, many, many years in the making. This is something would be launched in 2026. But this year we have 2 by invitation programs, one in Germany and one in Mexico, where people who considering this would be invited to give it a go, to see if this is what they would like to pursue, if this is what they would like to explore. It's a master training program, 18 months so far, kind of like schedule. This is something that I haven't done yet. So that would be something interesting to definitely to look forward to. So yeah, that's a lot of other aspects in my life that that I could say that I'm looking forward to. Some of them are more tangible, others are a bit more veiled through its less, let's say, defined way. Perhaps that shall suffice.
That's beautiful. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Thank you for this conversation, Igor.
Thank you for initiating it. Thank you. I enjoyed it greatly.
Hey, beautiful listener, you have made it all the way through. And I want to take a moment to say thank you. And you can do me an enormous favor. It's all I'm going to ever ask from you. And that is to go to your podcast app right now. And if you enjoyed the episode, give the podcast a 5-star rating. If you want to write 1-2 words or sentences, even more powerful, even better. Thank you, already in advance. And also, while you're at it, just click on that follow button, on that bell notification, so that you never miss a new episode. All of that just contributes, and it helps me to increase the reach of the podcast. That means I can attract bigger guests, and that means I can deliver more powerful episodes. So it's a tiny thing. I'm only gonna ask this little favor of you ever, not more. 10-15 seconds of your time, a couple of clicks, that's it. Makes a huge difference for me as a creator. So thank you so much.